Well, thank you, Natasha, and thanks to the organisers for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be here. As Natasha hinted, my background is very much in mathematics and applied mathematics and stochastic computation. But I've had an interest in networks over a long period. And the topic I'm talking about today, I think, overlaps a little bit with some of the ideas which have been mentioned today, in particular the idea of graphlets or motifs, and also evolving networks, networks where the connections change over time. So those are two of the themes. I'm really motivated from this piece of work through social network analysis, so looking at human beings and how they form associations like friendships, in particular online connections. But I hope you'll appreciate that the model here is quite general. And I'm focusing on triadic closure. This is the formation of triangles in networks. And there are many other contexts, including many biological contexts, where we tend to see a prevalence of triangles in the network. And what I'm focusing on today is a mechanism, which is one particular way in which triangles may be formed in networks over time. So I'll introduce a model, and I'm using the word model from my own applied mathematics perspective. It's a mechanism which may cause triangles to happen, and we'll study it using tools from chemical kinetic network reactions. I'm using some ideas from this sequence of papers. The paper at the bottom there is the one that we'll focus on most in this presentation. So triadic closure is an idea which has a very long history. It was first proposed in the social sciences. And if you think of friendships that evolve over time, the idea is that if person B and person C are not friends at the current time, but they have a friend in common, person A, then perhaps they're more likely than they would be otherwise to form a friendship. And why is that the case? Well, first of all, because they have a friend in common, they're more likely to meet. Because they have a friend in common, that friend can vouch for them and maybe suggest that they get to know each other. And person A has an incentive for B and C to become friends in that they can use less time and energy by forming a group of three than two pairs. What I'm going to do today is to use that idea. So if B and C are not connected, but they have a connection in common to another neighbor, then they're more likely to become connected. I'm going to extend that a little bit because B and C might have many neighbors in common. So the more neighbors they have in common, the more likely they're going to be to become connected. So that's the basic mechanism I want to look at. And you might appreciate that that mechanism may also arise in other contexts. A little bit about the notation. We're going to work in terms of the adjacency matrix. So these are undirected connections. So we have a symmetric adjacency matrix. I and J are connected if there's a 1 in position ij and a 0 otherwise. Once you have your adjacency matrix, you can take the square. That's the product of A with A. And basic linear algebra tells us we can write that as a summation. And one way to interpret that summation is that we're going over all the possible neighbors labeled by P and asking, is I connected to P and is P connected to J? So if you have a 1 times a 1 in that summation, that means P is a neighbor of both I and J. So squaring the matrix in the ijth position tells you precisely how many neighbors I and J have in common. So there's a simple way to count common neighbors just by squaring the matrix, and that's a nonlinear operation, you'll notice, in the sense that we have a squared term. So we're going to use that in the model, and I'll set up the framework of the model now. We're going to look at a fixed number of nodes in the network, so a fixed population, little n. We're going to look at discrete time points. So this network's going to evolve over discrete times. And at each time, we have a network. So I'm going to use the superscript with a k to denote the adjacency matrix at time k. That's going to be a symmetric matrix of zeros and ones. And we're going to let this evolve according to what's called a discrete time Markov chain. So that means given the state of the network at the current time, there's a transition probability telling us the probability of transitioning to any network at the next time. Now that's a very general setting. There'll be lots of different probabilities if you try to write down that model. So we're going to simplify in a way that we think is reasonable. And we're going to assume what we call edge independence. So given the network at the current time k, that will contain edges and missing edges, then the probability at the next time of any particular edge either appearing or disappearing will be independent of any of the other probabilities of other edges appearing or disappearing. So that edge probability, the birth or the death of an edge, depends only on the current state of the network. And that simplifies the model, gives us far fewer parameters to worry about. And this is a framework that we've used in different contexts, and we're going to use it in this context to try to capture this triadic closure effect. So we have these little n people. They can either become friends or stop being friends. And remember, AK is the adjacency matrix. We're going to put things in terms of three parameters. So we're going to assume there's a basal probability of death of an edge. So if an edge exists at time k, it has a fixed probability of dying at the next time. And it's the edge birth where we capture triadic closure. So between nodes I and j, if they're not connected, what's the probability they become connected at the next time, depending on the current state? Well, delta there is another basal probability, just some overall chance of two people bumping into each other, if you like. But then epsilon is the strength of the triadic closure effect. And inside those brackets, we have the square of the adjacency matrix. And it's the ijth entry that we use for the edge between I and j. So that simply counts how many neighbors I and j have in common. And the more they have, the more effect this triadic closure property adds to the probability of edge birth. Okay, so it's a simple model that tries to capture this effect that triangles tend to be closed. An edge which closes many triangles is more likely to arise than some other edge. You need some constraints on those parameters just to make sure that probabilities lie between 0 and 1. And I'll show you a simulation, one path of the Markov chain or one trajectory of the networks for this choice of parameters. In particular, there's 100 nodes in the network. So these are spy plots. As you go along each row, time is increasing. A dot in the matrix indicates the presence of an edge, and the lack of a dot indicates there's no edge. All I want you to notice here is that as time increases, we have a buildup of edges. So the network becomes less and less sparse over time. And this was starting with what we call an Erdos-Renyi random graph, a sample from that distribution. So to begin with, the edges exist independently with probability 0.3 at time 0. And I'm showing the Markov chain evolving over time. And although the network changes over time, the density of the edges tends to settle down. So the proportion of edges in the network tends to settle down to around 71%. So keep that in mind. And that's my macro parameter of interest, this edge density. When I go from the micro scale to the macro scale, it's going to be the edge density that I'm interested in. So here's another simulation with exactly the same model and the same parameters. This time I'm starting with just a different initial condition. So now there's only a 15% chance of each edge existing at time 0. So we start with a sparser network, same model, same parameters. This time, as you increase over time, the network becomes less rich. We tend to a sparse state. And after a long enough time period, the density of the edges settles down to around 5%. So the same models give me different long-term behavior, and we believe we have an explanation for that, at least somewhat heuristically. So we're going to do what's called a mean field analysis. A couple of things which are definitely true. This is an ergodic Markov chain, so every possible state can be visited. In particular, if you think of one edge, so pick a pair of nodes, look at that edge over time, the frequency with which that edge exists over time will tend to a constant. That's one of the consequences of ergodicity. So there'll be some proportion of time at which you see that edge existing. Now, there's nothing special about that edge. All these nodes are equivalent, so it must be the same proportion for all those edges. So there's some number p star, and as you go forward in time, you're going to see each edge exists with a frequency p star. So that's a sort of Erdos-Renyi graph. There's a sort of probability of an edge that's independent over all the edges. So the next bit is heuristic. We're going to do this mean field type analysis. We're just going to pretend that we have an Erdos-Renyi graph at every time point. So the nice thing about that is that the Erdos-Renyi graph is characterized by one parameter, which is our macro parameter, the edge density, pk. So instead of looking at the evolution of the entire network sequence, try to understand the evolution of this single scalar parameter, pk, over time. And we wrote down this mean field model completely heuristically to begin with. How does pk evolve over time? So what's the chance of two edges an edge existing at the next time? Well, 1 minus omega, that's 1 minus the death rate times pk. So if the edge doesn't die, then it stays there. The 1 minus pk, this corresponds to edge birth. And remember, we have a basal rate delta for edge birth, and then we have this epsilon strength from triadic closure. You've picked two nodes. There are n minus 2 nodes available to be neighbors. What's the chance of both of those edges existing? Well, assuming independence, that's going to be pk squared. So that's the chance of a neighbor, and there are n minus 2 of those possibilities. So that's what we're using for our mean field approximation. It's just a scalar iteration. But the nice feature here is that the triadic closure gives us a nonlinear term in the iteration. So we have up to cubic terms now in this iteration. If you look for real roots of that equation, look for steady states, then potentially there are 3 real roots, or maybe there's 1. If you have 3 real roots, then in this type of equation, generically, 2 of them are stable, the 2 outside roots, and the 1 in between is unstable. That's classic discrete dynamics. If you wanted to interpret this as a differential equation, you can think of the mean field iteration as approximating an ODE. So I've written down there the corresponding continuous time scalar ODE that would determine this macro parameter. So in the pictures I showed earlier, for those parameters, there were indeed 3 real roots. One of them is around 5%, and one of them is around 72%. Those are the 2 stable roots of the iteration. And there's one in between at around 22% or 22.9, which is the unstable fixed point of that scalar iteration. So the mean field approximation does seem to tell us something about the long time behavior of this microscale network evolution. Here's another similar picture. The colored lines here are microscale simulations, so trajectories of the Markov chain, where I've just given you the edge density. So for each adjacency matrix, this is the density of non-zeros in the matrix, and the black solid line is the corresponding mean field approximation. So in this case, the mean field approximation does a good job both of describing the transient behavior and also the long time behavior. So in this case, all the paths are going to this 71% or 72% edge density. That's starting from around 40% edge density initially. If I start very close to that unstable fixed point for my initial condition, then because it's unstable, the system can't really stay in that position. What's it going to do? Well, it depends on the microscale details. So here are 4 independent paths. In one case, because of the microscale transient computation, the choices of random numbers, one of the paths has managed to escape and get up to the high density regime, but 3 of those paths decided to go down and follow the low density regime. So you can't possibly predict what's going to happen other than to say one of those 2 choices is likely to take place based on the mean field analysis. I think this is interesting for various reasons. If you were trying to intervene with this network evolution, this tells you that if you put some effort in early on and get the network to evolve towards whichever of those 2 states you want, then you can then leave it alone and it will self-organize into one of those 2 states. So as long as you sort out the initial behavior, this will self-organize into one of these 2. Okay. We have done some tests on real data. I don't want to get into too much detail, but we took an online interaction data set from China and tested the validity of the model in the sense of hypothesis testing whether the Triadic closure term was valid in the model. And we had statistical evidence that the Triadic closure term was appropriate. So there's a paper there you can look at if you're interested in that. This is quite a large scale computation we had to do. What I want to focus on, because I think it might be of interest here, is that there's another way of trying to get into this bistability behavior, and that's using ideas from chemical kinetics. So what we're going to do now is look at models which work on the edges themselves. So capital N is the number of possible edges given little n nodes. Think of those as species, and think of this edge birth and edge death as a chemical reaction between these species. So the EIJ corresponds to the edge being present, and OIJ corresponds to absence of the edge. And then we can think of these 3 reactions taking place. So the first 2 are completely trivial. A missing edge can become present, and a present edge can become missing. The third reaction there is our Triadic closure. So if the indices are appropriate, then if ij is the missing edge and a jk and an ik exist, then we can have this Triadic closure, and the oij on the left becomes an eij on the right. So that's just a chemical reaction expression of what we think is going on. If we now regard that as our exact model, we can look at that. What we're thinking really here is that there's a hierarchy of models. So capital N is like a parameter. I want to understand how this model might behave for large values of n, where approximations might be appropriate. And I'll try to convince you shortly that the reaction constant for that third reaction, which I'm calling C3 hat here, really is some universal constant C3 scaled by the square root of the system size n. So that's something that took us quite a while to work out. Okay, so there's a technique for simulating chemical reactions that many of you will be aware of. It's sort of a special case of Petri nets, if you like. Once you have these chemical reactions, you can do stochastic simulation, sometimes called Gillespie's algorithm. So this requires you to draw a couple of random numbers at each step. One random number gives you a time for the next reaction, and the second random number tells you which of the reactions you're going to fire. So computationally, it's a very simple thing to do. It can be expensive, but it's very simple. Pick a time, and then pick a reaction, then update the system according to that reaction. Okay, so I won't go through the details too carefully, but given the state of the system, you can then take a step and update. And here's a picture for a different set of parameters that we'll look at, where again, I'm doing the microscale simulation, and I'm then extracting the edge density at each time point. Now, in this case, with these parameters, there are the two stable roots are around 0.167 and 0.5, and the unstable root in between is around 0.33. And you can see here the system switches between those two stable roots pretty much. So there's a cluster of time points where we have values around the lower of the stable roots, and then there are other time points where we have values around the higher stable root, and the unstable root in between sort of, in a sense, is encouraging that switching. Okay, so this is classic bistability for this macro parameter. And those roots, 0.167 and 0.5 and 0.33, again, are the cubic roots from that mean field model. So can we say any more, given that we have this chemical kinetics framework? Well, one simple thing to do is look at the edge density over time. So one thing you can prove involves the chemical master equation, so a standard tool in chemical kinetics, giving you the probabilities of various states evolving over time. If you look at the very special case where you have the same initial condition for all the E's, that's all the edge presents, and the same initial condition for all the O's, all the missing edges, then this reduces to a scalar ODE, and the chemical master equation then matches exactly that mean field ODE. So that's one sense in which you can justify the mean field ODE a little bit more rigorously. We can also do something called a thermodynamic limit, something along those lines. So this is where we forget about topology. So remember, the previous model had an EIJ for every pair INJ and an OIJ. So we kept all the topology going at every time step. You can do something simpler by throwing away the topology and just counting how many edges are present and how many edges are therefore missing at time t. So that would give us these three chemical reactions where O is just a species that consists of edges. So the species is edge. Sorry, E is the species edge, O is the species missing edge. So an O can become an E can become an O, and an O plus an E can become three E's if we have triadic closure. Okay, so those are the three reactions again. But that third one is now a bit trickier to understand. Just to be clear now, we have two variables in the state vector. X1 is now counting how many edges are present, and X2 is counting how many edges are missing. They add up to capital N. So those first two reactions are just first order reactions, very simple to model. The corresponding, what we call propensity functions, are obvious. But what about this triadic closure reaction? Because we've thrown away all the topology. So we don't know whether that reaction is going to happen or not. So we have to make some sort of approximation. And this is going to be similar to the mean field approximation I discussed earlier. So we're only concerned about cases where the new edge closes a triangle. So let's think about combinatorics. If we know how many edges are present, therefore how many edges are missing, then how likely is it that we'll have one of these appropriate combinations on the next step? So we need these three things to happen. There's an edge absent, and there's a present edge of the appropriate form, and there's another present edge of the appropriate form. And we don't have any labels. We don't know what the I's and J's are. So we have to make an assumption, and we're going to assume here that the nodes have the same degree. So we're assuming regularity, which is similar to the mean field assumption I mentioned earlier. Once you assume that those nodes have similar degrees, then you can do some combinatorics, and there's quite a lot to get through here. I don't want to labor this too strongly this late in the day. But once you've chosen the missing edge, then a proportion 1 over little n of the present edges are appropriate, and then a proportion 1 over little n squared are appropriate to fill that open jaw. So you can, assuming that degrees are equal, you can work out what proportion of these possible O plus E plus E's actually are of the right form. So that lets you define your propensity function, And that's where you get this universal constant C3 for the reaction rate, which scales with a capital N squared. So that's the appropriate scaling, we think, that's going to capture this triadic closure. So this is the macro scale model. It has two states now, but there's really only one state because the sum of missing and present edges is fixed. So we can eliminate one of those variables. And we really have now a very simple scalar birth and death process, which is counting edges over time. And we can write down in particular the birth rate and the death rate. So they're traditionally called lambda and mu. In this setting, it's an ergodic Markov chain, ergodic process. So it does have a steady state. And in this very simple setting, we can actually write down exactly what the steady state is. So it's based on the ratios of the birth and death rates for different states. So we have an explicit formula for the steady state. Once you have that, you can then do a bit more analysis. So we have a result here which says, and this is for sufficiently large system size, so capital N, number of edges, is sufficiently large, then that macro scale, that scalar birth and death process, has a bimodal steady state, so two peaks in the steady state, if and only if that cubic equation has three real roots. And the two peaks of the modes do correspond asymptotically to the two outer real roots of the cubic. So this is one rigorous way of trying to explain the behavior that's been seen. And I'm showing here a picture of that exact macro scale steady state for this choice of parameters that we had earlier. And you see those two peaks, they correspond to the largest and the smallest of the three cubic roots. And there's a dip in the middle corresponding to the unstable root. Okay. For those of you that enjoy diffusion processes, this idea of a thermodynamic limit can be pushed a little bit further. So you can go essentially from Poissons to Gaussians. So this would be an Ito or a stochastic differential equation where YFT is now a real valued process capturing the edge density. And you can study that and get very similar results coming out. And you can take the thermodynamic limit even further and make it into a deterministic process. So this would be what in chemical terms we call the simple reaction rate equation for the process. Excuse me. And that looks exactly like the mean field ODE that we had earlier. So we think this way of chemical reaction modeling, then taking appropriate approximations, is perhaps the most systematic way of understanding that mean field analysis, which seems to describe the behavior of the system quite nicely. So here's a picture where we compare those two models. So at the bottom level, we have the microscale model with all the EIJs and the OIJs reacting over time. And we extract the edge density at each time point and plot it. So that gives us the red trajectory. And the black trajectory is the corresponding very simple scalar birth and death process where we model immediately the edge density. And these are just independent paths of the two processes, so they're not supposed to be identical. What we're hoping to capture is the statistics. So I think it's reasonable, looking at the picture, to think that those processes seem to be describing the same types of statistics. And if you do lots of runs of these two models and look at the steady states, then you get this picture. So in the red here is the macro scale birth and death process, and the blue dots come from the underlying microscale. So there's a good agreement there between those two models in the terms of their steady state behavior. Okay. So let me just wrap up. We have a framework here which I think is useful in general of this idea of edge independent dynamics. So what happens on the next time step in terms of edges appearing or disappearing depends on the current state of the network, but is independent over all the different edges. There are quite a few different mechanisms you can capture within that framework. The one I focused on today was this triadic closure idea. And the reason we looked at this is because we knew it was going to introduce a nonlinearity. In this case, it's a cubic nonlinearity. And cubics have 3 roots, and 2 of them tend to be stable, and that corresponds to the bistable behavior that we observed in practice. The first paper we wrote was just completely heuristic, and then we used this chemical kinetics framework now, which we think is a useful tool for trying to understand a bit more carefully how those approximations might work. And at least in the birth and death scalar case, you can actually prove things about the process. Okay, so we think there are lots of applications where this might be useful. We have analyzed that model a bit more carefully in other contexts, but I didn't think it was appropriate to give you more mathematical results, but you can say more about some of these processes. One thing that's of interest to me is that in the social network context, the model that we have in principle allows arbitrarily large degrees. So in principle, you can have lots and lots of friends. And as the system size increases, nodes will tend to pick up more and more friends. Whereas in practice, it's been argued empirically that human beings, because of our cognitive limitations, we can't maintain beyond a certain number of friendships. And 150 experimentally has been touted. This is called the Dunbar number. And even online, it's been argued that people don't have more than around 150 meaningful relationships with other people. So we could build that into the model, have some sort of saturation that limits the number of, essentially the degree of any node in the model. That would make it more realistic. And getting back to some of the talks today, what I focused on here was entirely the case of triangles, so an open wedge becoming a triangle. You could look at other motifs or graphlets. If you had some reason to suspect that certain types of motif might arise in your network, then you could try to build one of these models, which would then give you some opportunity to analyze the long-term behavior. So that would involve in essentially longer term or higher order interactions. That would give you higher powers of the adjacency matrix, things like cubes and to the power of 4. You'd have a more interesting nonlinearity. You can certainly do that, but we're a bit wary of doing that ourselves because the mean field approximation that we're using works quite naturally when you're talking about triangles closing. The independence assumption or the constant degree assumption fits in quite naturally. If you started building larger, for example, larger sizes of complete cliques, then I think the independence would be much harder to justify. So you could certainly simulate those models and try to build mean field approximations, but I think you'd have a harder time getting something that worked accurately. Okay, so thanks for your attention. I appreciate you being here at the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Des. All right. Do we have questions? Yes. At the back. Yeah. And
Thanks for the talk. I found it super fascinating how you're drawing from the social science network perspective to try to give a perspective on biology. What would that look like on multimodal graphs? So if I have colored edges, say co-expression and protein-protein interaction, but follow different dynamics in triadic closure that have a different, or that have one of them has quadratic closure and one of them triadic closure, would that also be neatly modelable with a mean field equation? Or
I mean, I guess there's more than one way you could try to model it. You could have an adjacency matrix with, rather than zeros and ones, have more than one type of entry, but from some discrete set. I think that's the most natural thing to do. And then you could certainly build the appropriate discrete model for that. Yeah. Just that with that version, what's the edge density going to be if you start averaging over different numbers? So you might also build a tensor version of the model. That would be another way to go. So I think it depends on what question you want to answer, but there certainly are opportunities for that.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. I was intrigued by the nice convergence of the Erdős-Renyi graphs to this two stable equilibria.
Right. Yeah.
of course, we know that biological networks don't look like Erdős-Renyi networks. I mean, most
Yeah.
prominently, they have modular structure and they have like a very heterogeneous degree distributions.
Yeah.
Have you any idea whether we could do something similar with a planted partition model and see how there you then have maybe more equilibria points or something like this?
Yeah, that's certainly of interest, but I should make it clear maybe that Erdős-Renyi was just an approximation, because those graphs have lots of triangles in them, which Erdős-Renyi doesn't. The very rich, the 0.72 network, each network would not look like an Erdős-Renyi.
But
So
the
in
initial
some average
conditions
sense,
are
yeah.
Erdős-Renyi.
The approximation we used to get the mean field model just threw in the Erdős-Renyi ansatz, yes.
So, but in the simulation, the initial condition was always
Oh yes,
Erdős-Renyi?
yes, yeah.
Okay.
But the initial condition makes very little difference. They just it just determines which of those two states you evolve to.
Okay, I understand.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Are there other questions? Yes, one more.
So thank you very much. It's a bit thinking out loud, but I'm thinking in the biological network, in the molecular network, we have two kind of absent edges. We have the fun that are the edges that have not been discovered yet, but that
Right.
exist,
Yeah.
and the one that are truly absent. And I was wondering if it's something you can model, like you would put more triangles in this. I don't know exactly. It's just that it makes me think about these absent edges being true NA and not just not discovered ones.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. It's not clear what information you could build in. I mean, you could have a scalar value for the edge, like a weighted edge graph, where some edges you have more confidence in. That would be certainly possible.
Yeah,
maybe that's not
at,
quite
at
the
the
same
end of
thing.
the day, it ends up like your triangles. It ends up as closer, but I think it's interesting to see it this way too.
Yeah. See, once you take expectations, you get real numbers. So, in a sense, we are dealing with weighted edges in at some level of this modeling scenario. So I think you could build some of that uncertainty in through that process. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah, thanks, Des. This was fascinating, and I really like your closing remarks. How maybe we could generalize your model for higher order structures, etc. And in biology, not only in molecular networks, we now track the dynamics of transcriptional changes, let's say on the single cell level, etc. And then we could see really what's going on there, perhaps to explore it with those models. But not only that, I mean, in terms of your social networks, I wonder really how the COVID pandemic has changed the way people interact, and this number, if it's lower now than it used to be, maybe it's higher on online networks than in reality, etc. So there are many things that could be done.